Thomas?
Thanks very much, that was really interesting. Thank you, fascinating. It's kind of funny because they're used to reading like Supreme Court judgments, sort of US or the ECJ and stuff, and reasoning from first principles. It's always just like, it's kind of interesting, I suppose. There's no connection at all, but there's a sort of sense that, at the point at which we're leaving, in that sense, the reasoning to someone who looks at the Court of Justice becomes more like the Court of Justice. In the same way that leaving the EU has sort of nationalised and given a stronger footing to principles of supremacy and things like that than they ever existed when we were a member until tomorrow 11. That was really fascinating. I just wanted to ask a couple of questions. First of all, I was wondering if you're thinking about this move, and I think it is actually, I really think it is, it kind of is there, is that move to these background principles as informing more sort of specific legal outcomes. I was wondering, is there kind of enough there, do you think? The first question is whether you think there's enough there of an anchor for the courts to develop these sets of background principles. Because on the one hand, you're sort of saying, or the argument is that it's quite radical that the courts are beginning, or the Supreme Court is beginning to be more like a classic sort of European Kelsian, sort of that type of model of constitutional court. But those courts, of course, do fall back on more, there is a stronger sense of an anchor in terms of some constitutional text type thing. Is there enough there just to anchor? Because I mean, you mentioned political accountability, for example. It does feel like, oh, where did that come from? And I can see your explanation of it is there. It's kind of there, but is there enough? And what stops them from finding another one? The principle of Tuesday or something like that.
I like that one. You can't alter the constitution on a Tuesday.
But is there enough there to anchor it to, even without the democratic legitimacy questions, there's something kind of there, even if you ignore them, which seems to, for me, a little bit of a concern. And that leads me to my second question, which is not yet happened, but it's a kind of second order question of, if this is where it goes, and this is how it develops, how do you manage the interaction of these different principles? Because originally, or classically, if it was parliamentary sovereignty versus the rule of law, really, wasn't anything else. But if you're getting these new, if we're getting a richer sense of background principles, then how do we kind of deal with those? Is it just going to collapse back into parliamentary sovereignty versus kind of common law type things? Or is there something else there? Because obviously this wasn't really an issue in kind of Miller Cherry type stuff, but you can foresee an example. I mean, I don't know how far you push it, but if you were to say, I mean, you talked about protecting constitutional features. I mean, I was thinking, what happens if like the Scottish Parliament's abolished or something like that? And I know it. But you could say it's well, where you can see where I'm going with that.
For constantly not giving legislative consent motions.
But I just wondered. So the question of this is basically kind of the second order. How do you think we can manage those challenges? But really fascinating. Thank you so much.
One more.
Yeah, so I'm always, this is a bit from left field, but I'm always very interested in the relationship between legal academia and how this kind of influences court judgment. And it was something that you touched on, and Mike also mentioned, this development towards a theory, well, towards legal reasoning, which kind of starts with first principles and goes down. I just wonder the extent to which that may reflect, and I'm not terribly au fait with UK constitutional literature, but may reflect a change in the literature and common law constitutionalism being talked about so much in the literature, and the influence that academia may have had on the court in that sense.
Shall we pause here and give you a chance to respond, and then we may be open for another round?
Okay. Well, thank you. They're all really interesting and fascinating questions, and I'll try to do my best to answer them. I might use interpretive acrobatics to get out of them as well, so illegitimately. So that would be an illegitimate use of language. I see where you're coming from. When you look particularly at things like anything applying the principle of legality starts to look a lot like let's use some linguistic acrobatics. And the way in which you always explain, and Anna's Minnick in particular, I teach administrative law, have done for a long time, and whenever you come to the Anna's Minnick case, you can see the students looking at you and they think, okay, they're writing down, and suddenly you say, but this was only a purported determinant, not real, and they're like, what? They kind of beginning, no, come on. So I can see where it's coming from, because it just looks like an odd thing to do, and I think you're right, it does call into question, but it very much looks at are they doing this just to disguise what they're really doing? Is this a kind of old big fudge? And we've had this big kind of long discussion of it. We play with the wordings, but really that's just ex post facto reasoning afterwards to come up with the conclusion. I honestly don't think that is what they are doing, but I can see how it can look like that. And the reason I don't think that is what they are actually doing is because if that's what they really wanted to do, why bother doing it, if that makes sense? So if they absolutely 100% think that the job of the court is always to just make it up and tell you what the answer is, and it's for all parliamentary justice and that's the end of it, why even bother trying to justify it through legislation? So I think they do see wording of legislation as a restriction. I think they do think there are restrictions on what words can do, and so there is something restraining them, and I don't think it's just all a big con game, but at the same time I think that they're constantly in this kind of battle of, if I can see this is undermining these fundamental principles, how can I find a way of reconciling this? And is there a way I can reconcile it? So I think it's more like that. I don't think it's complete fudge, but sometimes some of the strained meanings do look so strained, you begin to wonder how on earth you can justify how they got there. But we focus on the big cases, and we focus on where these big issues and clashes come. What we tend not to focus on so much as academics is the day-to-day run-of-the-mill admin cases that go through the courts all the time, in which they will be looking very carefully at the wording and applying this very carefully and very clearly. We'll be looking at purposes. Yes, they'll have these cases in the background, but they predominantly will be looking at the wording, looking at background principles. And we talk a lot about the principle of legality, and we look at big cases like Evans and Unison, because we look at them and think, there's a bit of interpretive acrobatics going on there. Well, are we really justifying where they're going? But we don't necessarily look at some of the other cases of the principle of legality, where they go away and say, well, I know you want to argue this fundamental principle, but if you look at the legislation, if you read it, it clearly and specifically says you can't do that. I can't read this word in, I can't read this word down. So I think these are big cases where you've got this, what looks like interpretive acrobatics, because there are real tensions between the background principles and the words. But I think in the normal cases, they're not doing it. So I don't think it's necessarily a fudge. I think they kind of feel almost like caught between a rock and hard place. They can see the need to protect these principles. They can also see the need to protect the wording of Parliament, and they're sort of trying to see what they can do without completely undermining both. And sometimes it does look extreme, but I don't think they're trying it afterwards, if that makes sense. I think they are genuinely looking at these principles, but we won't know until we ask them, and they're not going to tell us. So, and they will always tell us that they're definitely looking at the purpose and the wording of the principles, I guess, if you ask them. So, but I can see where you're coming from, and I can see the criticism, particularly in those cases. So I don't think it's necessarily an answer, because I don't think there necessarily is one I can give you clearly. But personally, I don't think that's what they're doing, but I can see why you could read it that way. So, sorry, the bit of a fudge, but that's the kind of probably best I can do. So the second lot of questions, yeah, it is ironic that we're becoming more like the CJEU as we leave, and it's also illustrating some of Mike's points that if you've got 11-0, there's no room for discussion, and they do start to look like CJEU decisions when you look at them going, I've absolutely no idea how you reach this conclusion, but that clearly is the answer, so obviously that's where we're going. So I can see the problem moving in a direction, and I can see the kind of, it is odd that they're kind of moving in there. Is there enough to anchor them? No. And that's why I think they should be predominantly used for these extreme circumstances. So there is a lot of move towards thinking about, can we go back and look at these very precise principles and use them? And I think they're not clear enough. They're not necessarily clear in some instances that they can even operate in the way we want the principle of legality to operate. So that's where we get cases like Muan and the right to vote, where there's the kind of right to vote, but not really, and not one where you can only, that operates in the same way, because unless Parliament came in and started giving the franchise and setting up the road, we wouldn't really have a right to vote. So it's a kind of, they don't necessarily provide very, very clear, precise limits. But what they can do is what they're doing in military. Provide a way for you to then think through how you interpret what you already can do, or how you apply a particular head of judicial review and how you push it and develop it. So I think that it's more legitimate for them to be doing that. So if you look at parliamentary accountability, I don't think this is the courts enforcing the Convention of Parliamentary Accountability. I think parliamentary accountability is a background constitutional principle that then gets used to influence how conventions develop. It's part of the third criteria of Jennings. There's a reason for this. This is why we have these particular conventions of individual ministerial responsibility, for example. Or it can be used to influence how case law develops. I think what they're doing with Miller-Cherry is they're saying, well, we know from cases like Fibre Games Union that you can restrict the scope of the prerogative power. And we know maybe what was really going on Fibre Games Union was to stop the executive undermining the expressly of what was set out in the legislation. We know that was influencing why they were going to read that statutory provision in the way that they did in order to restrict the use of the prerogative power. And now we're just saying, okay, and now we're going to use it to work out, with this particular prerogative we've not looked at before, we know we define the scope, how does the scope work here? In exactly the same way in Birmingham and Lord Advocate, yes, you can go away and destroy the property before it falls into the hands of the enemy, but because of background principles, you have to pay compensation. You could see it in the same way. It's not how they reason it, because it's an old case and that they talk about the scope, but you can kind of almost see it the same way. I think that's more legitimate. What becomes more problematic is there is a very, very clear and precise meaning to this particular right that I've just discovered, and this is what it means, and now I'm going to read down every single piece of law to get that. That, for me, I see the concern, because there isn't always enough to anchor it. So things like Whiter and Sims, a very, very precise right that you didn't know you had, that suddenly they haven't specifically expressly said you don't have it. What? And that I can see the concern more. But when they're operating more as background principles to develop what we've already got, I think it's less problematic, because you're right, there's not as much of an anchor for some of them. So I can see the concerns. Is it all about parliamentary sovereignty against the rule of law, or is there something else going on? What orders and facilitates that? And the answer is different constitutional theories will tell you different things, because we'll draw on different background constitutional theories to tell you this. So if I was to ask that of my colleague Trevor Allen, he would tell me it is the rule of law. That is anchoring everything, Alison. And we'll have very interesting discussions over a cup of tea. And I will be told that yeah, perhaps I don't necessarily understand the Constitution the same way as Trevor Allen. And we'll part as great friends still. But we see it differently because we've got different background constitutional theories. If I were to talk to my colleague Mark Elliott, he would tell me it's all a different aspect of there's parliamentary sovereignty, there's the rule of law and the separation of powers, and they all apply and they all kind of balance against each other in different circumstances, in different ways, in different contexts. And he doesn't necessarily have a hierarchy per se. He tends to look at them and say, oh, you can see them balancing and pushing in different ways. What I've been trying to work on is seeing a kind of move away from understanding how different institutions interact with each other and what the separation of powers is by just looking at parliamentary sovereignty and rule of law. And instead saying, actually, thinking more about what the institutions are and what powers they should have, given their composition and their functions, should then play a role to help you understand how you get parliamentary sovereignty and rule of law to balance against each other. So I flip it round. And I think that is separation of powers in sort of a bigger sense of what powers do they have, how are they composed, what functions do they have, should then influence the other principles. But in terms of more detailed layering, you're right, that there isn't a clear necessary hierarchy. I think we're still developing it, which again adds to yet more uncertainty, not just we can't clarify them necessarily to anchor them, but also we then don't know which one beats the other one, which makes it even more difficult. And that's why I think we get legitimacy concerns. So I would say, fine when you're influencing development of common law principles specifically that way, less fine when you're using it precisely to read something down, and I would see sovereignty and rule of law as being influenced more by the different institutional structures rather than the other way around. So that's how I would do it, but that's because I have my own theory and it's different from other people's and just like arguing. What would happen if we abolished the Scottish Parliament? I don't even want to answer that one. One big difference is you have one of those wonderful statutes that doesn't really mean anything. So it is like Section 38. It is recognised that Parliament is sovereign. Yay! I didn't know that. Thank you for recognising that in Section 38 of the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Act 2020. I now know. It's recognising something and recognising the Scottish Parliament as a permanent institution of the Constitution. And what does it mean? What does it bear? And it's a kind of assertion of its constitutional importance, but could a court go away and say, actually, you've just abolished the Scottish Parliament, you're not supposed to because the Scottish Parliament didn't say you could. It's going to be very difficult for you to do so, because that provision doesn't clearly say, and you can't do this. And also you've got to read it against the backdrop of the specific Powers in the Scotland Act, which tell you various things, including that Westminster Parliament can legislate to modify the devolution settlement, obviously by convention with consent. So it's a tricky one, and I think, given the other statutory backgrounds, it can be very, very difficult for a court to say you can't abolish it if you just have a piece of legislation. So it's a tricky one. How far are judges influenced by academics? I wish I knew. Probably very little, to be honest. I'm sure they don't pay much attention to us. How far have they been influenced by kind of developing common law constitutionalism movements? I think they're very much aware of them, and there are justices of the Supreme Court who do engage with the academic literature and have written on these areas. So in that sense, you get an influence of what they think. I think they're aware of the literature. I think they engage with it. I think they are wisely trying to make sure that they don't show any obvious connections of which school they do not attach to, because the more they can show that they are independent, the better. And we can look at their judgments and say, oh, that looks like this school, that looks like this school of thought, that looks like they're influenced by this. But I think beyond that, I'm not really sure. They do talk to us occasionally. I mean, it is quite weird. And they sometimes send you emails. You're like, oh, hello. Okay. But I don't think there's anything beyond that. I don't think that it's a different job. And if they started engaging in academia and developing their academic theories, it would undermine their ability to perform their judicial function.
Sounds like the US Supreme Court.
Yeah. Yes. I'm not going there.
Shall we go for another round, or
yeah?
Any other question? Or maybe you shouldn't. You there are not.
Can I say one thing on the back of that? Just the final point.
Mike, how can I say no to you?
Well, I've already started talking now. But you could. You could.
You could ask jurisdiction.
Yeah, exactly.
It's prerogative powers.
It's only to say that is a really interesting question, isn't it? About how far they've been influenced by by academics. And I think your point is really interesting about, well, they are quite effective at keeping their affiliations largely controlled. You know, we probably would know that Hale and Kerr will be on the, whatever they think the liberal outcome is, they will push towards that. And, you know, we would have thought Sumption was quite pro-state and kind of like, but then they do unpredictable things at times, don't they? Like Sumption on both of the Miller cases. Yeah. Obviously the first one that he sat on, and then the second one when he was doing the rounds of the TV studios defending the right of the Supreme Court unanimously to overrule prorogation, which was fascinating. It weren't necessarily Sumption-esque in terms of his persona. And Wilson's another interesting one that you mentioned in Privacy International. You know, in Evans, he's kind of like, this is outrageous, you're completely ignoring the statute. In Privacy International, he's kind of similar. But then you see him in the prorogation case. Who's he tearing strips off? One of the barristers.
Yeah, and he really was going for, what about the effect? Have you thought about the effect? He was almost leading the charge, wasn't he?
He was, and I think he's also one of the moving parts in the cases around the rights of the Convention on the Rights of the Child and their status, isn't he? I know Lord Kerr is the primary one, but I think Wilson's there too. So that which is all quite interesting, but it does, you know, I'm not saying I want an American Supreme Court style thing at all, but at least the advantage of that is there's a degree of transparency, isn't there? It's like individuals kind of know what different judges think and what they'll do and what the expectations are, whereas before the Miller case, the first one, I sat down and tried to predict which ways they would go. Complete nonsense, completely wrong, and that was with a bit of sort of understanding of the context. So the idea that, you know, again, back to this sort of how do you engage the citizenry here? They've got no chance of knowing what's going on in the Supreme Court when we can't even discern it.
Yeah, I mean they do. That was one of the weird things about being outside the Supreme Court, that you could see the people protesting. And so they were split. It was like one side of the Supreme Court was that you are silencing the Parliament, how dare you? And the other side was, why are we still in Europe? How dare you? It was and that was very much the split on either side. And there was one person who, without fail, every evening would shout "Free Julian Assange." I have no idea why. I'm not holding him. So it was just to get the public space. But there was also somebody who every night without fail shouts out, "Who judges the judges? Who's judging the judges?" And it's an interesting question. And you're trying to kind of engage and say, well, you are. You can see what's going on. You can see the decisions. You can go and watch what's going on. But of course, the reality is, unless you're a legal nerd, you're not sat there watching every single judgment to see what's going on. And I think it does raise this kind of issue. And in terms of the predictions, everyone was playing the guessing game of Miller to Cherry and thinking, are they going to do this? Are they not going to do this? It was so quick as well that it was really difficult to predict where they were going to go. And people would try and ask me questions. Oh, you've read judgment, you know the judges. What do you think they're going to do? Do they have particular schools of thought? And you're thinking, well, yes and no. Because Lord Reid, on the one hand, is, I am not going down the Privacy International line, but on the other hand, he decided unison. So it's kind of like, how do you, and because they're much more subtle than pro-government, anti-government, or pro-court, anti-court. It's very much about what precisely is in front of me, how well has it been argued, and what do I think is the most persuasive one on these particular factors. I think that influences them far more. And also when you look at things like the connection between Unison and Cherry Miller, which wasn't necessarily in Privacy International, is it's like broad element of access of these kind of constitutional foundations in a sense. For Unison, it was, you are making it impossible for anyone to get to court. And Lord Reid was very strongly saying, no, that does not work. It doesn't matter when it's a kind of tiny little thing of one little aspect of judicial review in one little area. It is this broad element. If you are going to completely make it impossible for individuals to get to the court to protect their rights, then that is going too far. Whereas I can understand this ouster clause in the ins and outs because it's a different thing, different context, different way of applying it. And then when you come to kind of Cherry Miller, you might have thought, oh, if he's a very simplistic reading is always a bit anti-court. He might go this way. Of course not. He's going to look at it again in the circumstances and say, what is going on? And he'll look at it and say, okay, on what's been presented to me and how the argument goes, I can see that there are good grounds for not allowing it in these circumstances on these particular facts because it's so extreme. I think the mistake we sometimes make is thinking, let's take broad brush theory, but that's not what the judges are doing. Very, very specific circumstances, a specific case will then reach very specific answer. I think sometimes we try and put them in schools without realising that actually we're putting that onto them. So it's another one of my anecdotes. You can have this when it's all right because it's not nasty. So you can turn it off if you like. That's fine. I was co-examining a doctorate with Lord Reid. And we were talking about the ins and outs of judgments, and basically the conclusion of the discussion was joking about the fact that judges don't, think they know what their judgment means. Along comes an academic and tells them it means something completely different to what they thought it meant. And we were joking about this interaction between, what the judge thinks of when they're writing and what the academic thinks the judge is thinking of when they're reading the judgment aren't necessarily the same thing. And I think sometimes we jump to conclusions. He was also telling me of a lovely time when he went to give a talk and some students said to him that they really liked his judgments. Like, yeah, oh, which ones? The ones in Dorset Yacht. It's the wrong Lord Reid. Different Lord Reid. And he very nicely said, oh, I liked those too. Which I thought was a wonderful way of dealing with the situation. It just shows you that they're real people deciding very complex cases. I don't think we can just put them into simple schools, which is why I think we then find these contradictions, because the specific circumstance of the case will push in different directions. So I think the court's in safe hands with Lord Reid.
Thank you very much, and I think we should close on that note, and thank you both of speakers. Thank you very much.